everyone. I am LT World, and you're listening to the Like the World podcast. For those of you who don't know me, I am an author and writer who is deeply interested in controversial issues and interested in politics and culture and understanding different belief systems and philosophies. And on this channel specifically, I'll be striving to understand the different aspects of culture, whether it be critical theory or postmodernism or whatever it may be, and take a look at its history and take a look at both sides and try to better understand it so that we can both come away smarter than we were before. So if you enjoy this, please give it a listen. And on whatever platform you're watching this on or listening to this on, please subscribe and follow. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to discover more about me or want to buy one of my books or something, you can check me out at ltworld.info. Now, let's jump in to the podcast. So, today we are going to be talking about the background and history of critical theory. Yes, something that has been very prevalent in the news, has been very prevalent in society, and especially in the West. And it has specifically become really popular with critical race theory. That's been a hubbub of just noise and sound coming from media and from social media, from news and politics. It's everywhere. But what is critical theory? That's the basis for critical race theory, which is just a branch of critical theory. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. What is the background and history of critical theory? So, our background lesson today starts in 1818. A child with 8 different siblings was born in Germany to 2 Jewish parents. Now, this child grew up with a wide variety of influences and with an education. He grew up in a rather liberal school, or at least it was considered liberal. It was even suspected to be watched by the government and stuff because it was considered maybe a little bit too liberal at its time. And his parents were religious. His father was Jewish, at least, and his father was influenced by Kant and some of the Enlightenment thinkers, and therefore a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers had an impact on this child that I am describing to you right now. And this kid eventually grew up surrounded by all these different influences. He grew up really interested in politics, really interested in philosophy, and he grew up very influenced by a lot of these different thinkers that he came in contact with. So he went to university. He went to a couple universities. He went to Bonn and he went to Berlin, which were, I believe, in Germany as well. And he first went to study both law and philosophy, but ended up getting a doctorate in philosophy when in the 1840s, I think, roughly, 1830s, 1840s. This man would then eventually become a journalist, a writer, and also well-known radical, politically speaking. He was a part of a lot of clubs. He wrote a lot of controversial things. The government had tried to shut him down a lot of times, or he was not allowed to publish stuff in certain areas, in certain regions. He was considered a radical, politically speaking, and he grew a lot of attention and became well-renowned in his area, and ended up eventually growing old and dying at 1883 from illness and disease. And this man, who many have probably heard about, is Karl Marx. Yes, Karl Marx, the father of Marxism and the father of, well, at least the one who made communism kind of popular to this day. Now, Karl Marx did not create critical theory. He's not the one who coined a term. He's not the one who discovered it or anything like that. But Karl Marx did set a lot of groundwork for critical theory to arise. His writings on Marxism, his writings on communism, his writings on economic oppression and labor were very influential on the people who did end up making critical theory. So his whole thrust about economic disparity being one of the main causes, and socioeconomic disparity being one of the main causes for evil and ills and suffering in human civilization, set the groundwork for the critical theory that's going to come. And he specifically inspired a man by the name of Felix Wheel. Now, Felix Wheel was a young Marxist who found inspiration from Karl Marx's writings, specifically on economic oppression. He was very intrigued by the idea that socioeconomic status and income and money, and specifically capitalism, could be a very big cause for oppression, suffering, evil. And he really took that to heart, and he wanted a school to dive into Marxism and to dive into these different type of studies that Karl Marx promoted, And therefore, he invested a lot of his money into a school called the Frankfurt School in about 1923. And the Frankfurt School was founded in Germany in 1923, thanks to the help of people like Felix Wheel, who funded it. And then obviously there was a lot of teachers, professors, intellectuals, and other backers who were a part of this Frankfurt School. And now the Frankfurt School is where critical theory starts to get its origins, or starts to get its substance from. And the Frankfurt School was first intended to basically study Marxism even deeper, to kind of promote it. And the goal was to be able to, in a way, spread it across Germany, because the Frankfurt School was located in Germany. And the school originally, a couple of the main things the school focused on originally was the labor movement in Europe and anti-Semitism. And now this shouldn't be shocking, because Karl Marx grew up with two Jewish parents, and therefore anti-Semitism was actually a big part of his upbringing. He experienced it quite a bit. And the labor movement, because that was a big part of Marxist theory, this idea that the laborers ought to get their fair share, that capitalism causes a lot of suffering and ill, and all that stuff. So those were the two main things that they focused on within the Frankfurt School when it originally got started. However, some way down the road, it started to expand, and a lot of this expansion was thanks to the vision of Max Horkenheimer, who was also, no surprise, a Marxist. Now, he gave the Institute kind of not necessarily a new direction, but he gave the Institute at least a different direction. And he started growing intrigued by interdisciplinary integration, specifically of the social sciences. He wanted to see a broader spectrum of the social sciences being brought together, and he wanted to explore the complexity of social life. He wanted to explore the complexity of culture, and specifically with a Marxist mindset, understanding oppression, understanding how social structures impact people's lives, and understanding how economy impacts people's lives, understanding how these different things can impact injustice and oppression on a broader level. And he wanted to expose how complex the social life is, how culture is. However, around 1933, the Nazis shut down a Frankfurt School in Germany, most likely because they didn't appreciate the anti-Semitism being spread, the exploration of anti-Semitism being explored and studied in that school, probably is why they shut them down. Not like the Nazis were well known for being very open about why they did what they did. But the school ended up moving then to the U.S. And around this time period then, they were very inspired by Freud as well. Sigmund Freud and the psychoanalysis, the guy who really made that popular. They started becoming intrigued by him. So among their interdisciplinary studies in the social sciences, they started to incorporate also more psychoanalysis. And Marxism, I should throw this out there, Marxism took an atheistic approach to life. Karl Marx specifically called religion the opioid of the masses. He grew up religious, but then he became an atheist, and he saw religion as an opioid, as a painkiller, rather than anything true to it. And he thought, again, if you could create a society without oppression and create a better socioeconomic society, you would create a utopia on Earth. That's the best we could aspire for. So Freud was also a strict atheist, and therefore the Frankfurt School was very inspired by both Freud and Karl Marx. And so they started to take Marxism, Marxist studies, and started also look psychoanalysis from Freud, and started kind of combining them, and started doing these interdisciplinary studies among the different sciences and the different social sciences. Some of the different social sciences, like history, like sociology, like psychology, all these different social sciences, and they started to really develop a new way of looking at the world, which then, in 1937, brought us what we call critical theory. So Max Horkenheimer, the guy who gave the Institute, Frankfurt School, a kind of a new vision to a certain extent with his whole interdisciplinary studies and incorporating psychoanalysis with Marxism and psychology and sociology and history, combining them all together and seeing the complexity of society and culture. He introduced the words critical theory into an essay in 1937. And he specifically, in this essay, made a distinction between what he called critical theory and traditional theory. And so in that essay, he says, like, there's right now people approach the world in a traditional way, and how they create theories is very traditional. And he believed that was very flawed. And he proposed a new way to create theories, a new way to approach the world as a critical theory, and he saw that as a better mode of thinking or intellectual exploration. And as the Frankfurt School then progressed throughout the years, and as critical theory was coined and then spread throughout the universities, throughout intellectuals, it really started to catch fire in the West. And around the 50s and 70s era, during the social movements like feminism, the civil rights movement, and the gender theory movement, and these different movements and different upsurges in a way for civil rights in the 50s and 70s. During that time, a lot of these movements took in and incorporated critical theory, specifically at the university, specifically at some more radical fringes. They started to incorporate critical theory into them. And now, in present day, obviously with the internet and everything, and with politics, it has bubbled up with the advent of social media spreading about police violence and things like that. Critical race theory comes up. So that's how critical theory kind of spread throughout the West. And now we hear a lot about these different critical theories. So in Max Horkenheimer's essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, he asserts a difference between what he calls the traditional theory, which he thought was very prevalent, versus the critical theory, which he was proposing that how the world should view things. And so right now, I want to explain what he defined traditional theory as and what he defined critical theory as. And so according to Max Horkenheimer, a traditional theory would seek to maintain the status quo but still explore it. Okay. So Max Horkenheimer would say a traditional theory seeks to make the status quo more efficient. It assumes that the viewer of reality is observing how life really is, and therefore tries to explain it in terms of objective truth, in a sense. Objective reality, as if he's an unbiased viewer of an objective truth, which should sound familiar if you listened to my past couple of podcasts about postmodernism. And so, in other words, traditional theorists tend to assume they are unbiased observers of facts, then use those facts to describe the world as is. That's how Max described a traditional theorist. And again, that should sound kind of familiar to postmodernism. It sounds a little bit familiar as in how postmodernists critique or disagree, the side that they disagree with. But he said, a critical theory, on the other hand, recognizes that our perception in the world around us is a product of complex and social conditions, and therefore everything must be critiqued and analyzed, including theories themselves. So, theorists must challenge the masses while still recognizing their own biases and social conformity. However, they are supposed to constantly also look at society and critique it. And oftentimes the end goal of critical theory, especially in Max Horkenheimer's view at most Frankfurt School intellectuals, how they saw it, was that critical theory would lead to freedom, it would less oppression, and it would help with injustice, and specifically social injustice or political injustice, socioeconomic injustice. And it would hopefully improve society. In other words, the way that Max Horkheimer would explain critical theory is that since our perception is conditioned by society to think a certain way, and since facts and observations have been manipulated by society, we must critique social norms. All right. So I'm going to try to break it down now, even a little bit, try to make it more clear. Traditional theory is basically this idea that we observe the world and we try to describe it using a bunch of facts as if we are almost unbiased viewers and we're just using facts to describe and explain our worldview. While a critical theorist or a critical theory is one that assumes that the viewer is not unbiased, that they are biased, that they actually are the product of a lot of social input, parents, society, culture, religion, economic status, all these things. Therefore, they're completely biased and tainted, and they are not objective. And also that they perceive the world through those lens, through a social lens, through all these inputs, and therefore they can't actually observe the world objectively, and therefore someone who's a critical theorist must be both critical of themselves, critical of society, critical of truth, and kind of deconstruct and tear down society and point out injustices, point out problems, point out wrongs, and point out where there is oppression. And so again, this should sound very familiar to what we talked about in postmodernism, where it's a very skeptical perspective. And that's why they kind of go hand in hand, and that's why I wanted to do postmodernism and then do critical theory, because they kind of they're very similar in how people approach the world. So then the idea was, as I already said, the idea is that this would give ultimate hope. That eventually, if everyone would be this critical on theories, this critical on society, this critical on socioeconomic status, and if people would actually question everything, basically, that eventually this would lead to a better society. This would lead to, ideally, a utopian society where there's no socioeconomic injustice, where there is no oppression, and where there is no social oppression, stigmas, and bias, and tears down all those bad sort of structures. Now, Max Horkenheimer was a little bit less optimistic. A lot of times he didn't believe we would ever reach like a utopia, really. He kind of had more of a pessimistic view, but he hoped, and a lot of times he talked about kind of like hoping that this would lead to a better worldview, while some of his counterparts some of his other intellectual people at Frankfurt School believed that critical theory will eventually lead to a better society, one without evil or one without suffering to a certain extent. So that's kind of like the ultimate hope of critical theory. And it sounds very nice, at least the ultimate hope does. And that's how critical theory came to be about. That's how critical race theory, that's where it gets its origins from. Because it got basically critical race theory got adopted into the race movement in the 50s, 60s, 70s era, along with feminism got swept into the women's suffrage movement, 50s, 60s, 70s era. And that's how you get all these different critical theories that we have now today. That is the history and background of critical theory. That is kind of the progression of how we are and how we got to where we are now, politically speaking and socially speaking. And I'm just going to summarize real quick what we just went over. I'm going to summarize kind of the pinpoints. Karl Marx was a radical Marxist, obviously, radical communist, who promoted a lot of these ideas that socioeconomic oppression and injustice and socioeconomic structures cause most evil and pain in the world. He inspired Felix Wheel, who was a wealthy man, to help fund and start the Frankfurt School, which the Frankfurt School specialized in Marxist studies, which then, thanks to Max Horkenheimer, started including a lot of different social sciences, like Freudian thought, like psychoanalysis, like the geography and history and psychology and sociology, which then he coined the phrase critical theory, where actually once you look at the world, you start to realize that everything is a social construct, that we're all biased and all influenced by society and by people and by thought and by religion, that we can't be objective, and therefore we just must question everything and tear down structures, tear down societies, and point out injustices. And then this was adopted into future movements like the civil rights movement, the feminism movement, the gender movement. And then we got to today with the internet spreading all this stuff really quickly. And so that was a really quick breakdown. I think this actually might be one of my quicker episodes on critical theory and its impact on the West. Next time, we will be discussing arguments for and against critical theory. And we're going to better understand why it's a hot topic. And see whether or not critical theory makes sense. See whether or not it actually stands on its own 2 feet. And we might even divulge a little bit into some of the segments if we have time. So thank you for listening today. And if you liked what you hear, or if you felt like you learned a lot, please follow, subscribe, and you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram for updates and to discover more. And if you would like to read any of my books, again, ltworld.info. So now, without further ado, please go out there and light the world, my friends.